Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the next hook as use context. I feel the question and answer model helps to explain very elaborately, so I'm going with that model. So, what is use context in React? So, use context is a built-in React hook that allows a component to access shared data from the nearest context provider without passing the data through multiple level of components. It is commonly used for application-wide state that needs to be shared across any component such as authenticated user, theme, language, currency, user permission, feature flags. Without use context, React relies on props to pass data from parent to child. As an application grows, passing the same data through many intermediate components becomes difficult to maintain. This problem is known as prop drilling. Use context solves this by allowing any dissident component to read shared data directly from the nearest provider. Here, if you see the complete example talks about if there is a prop. So far, I have not given explanation about the props. It is also one of the important concept in React. I'll cover after the hook concept. So prop is also one of a component. It is something related similar to our properties in Java. It is a prop. So what happens is if you want, for example, very easy to understand example is, for example, if there is a your banking application or your like Amazon application. In all application, if you see there, the common thing for all the navigation page will be our cart. The cart. What is the thing we added? User. What is my username? All these details will be the common header throughout our application. Wherever you navigate, that will be in the same page. So if you want to have such a common data throughout different components which we are using, if it needs to be there, that point of time we need to use context. What use context do? Use context just share the data to the several level of to the components. You don't want to if you're using props, you want to use it into the parent child method, you want to use in all the components to use it. Instead of that, you will create a context and you pass the data in one common place and use it in another place. That is a very simple explanation. You will create a context and a provider and use the context in the necessary page. That is a simple example. We will see in the upgoing questions. So my context is created using createContext. React search upwards in the component tree for nested matching provider. Always the component will be in a hierarchical manner, parent-child relationship. So always the context will look for the nearest provider is what it is saying. We will see little bit about provider later. Okay, so for example, if a customer logging into a banking portal, the customer ID, customer name will be always that navigates to whatever the page, it may be account, it can be whatever the page he navigates, that the data will be needed is the sample explanation here. Why is context is useful? As I mentioned earlier, if for example, if I want to props drilling, this is what the props drilling. I have my app.jx is the main page. I have a single page application. From there, I can go to dashboard, fund transfer, beneficiary, every page I can navigate. If I'm not using context, I want to use this props in every component, a dashboard, every page I want to have this detail. If I have context, I can directly use the create the context separately as a customer detail or a customer object, something like that, and I can use directly into the confirmation page. I don't want to drill down the customer data in an unnecessary place. That is a main advantage. Here, every component receives and forwards the same prop, even though most don't use it. Even though it doesn't use it, we need it, but here it doesn't. You can use directly from that context. So when you are using context, what are the mistakes that we will do? We will do keep component specific state local with use state. Okay, bad example. If you want to have your such text, you should not have this such text as like this. You want to have it in the use state method like set such text format. I'll show in the later example. Creating one massive app context. For example, if in an application, in a web application, we need several such use context. For example, I need my theme context. I need user context, username, that what is the role I myself. I need my language context. So notification. So I need several context for a single application. For that, if I create one big context and try to use in all the components, then for example, I'm changing the username alone. For only username, the other unnecessary page also will re-render. So that is makes the application performance bad. So we should not use in the way. We should make it simple and small, so that will be very useful in the reusage. So treating context as a replacement for regex. Regex is one of a state management. It is having a different purpose completely, but it is so we are not it replacing for that purpose. Context is just for sharing data from for the different component to the different pages. That's so use context is a React hook. It reads data from the nearest context provider. We are going to see the context provider shortly now. It helps eliminating prop drilling. It's best for relatively stable shared data. The shared data is very important. Okay. It doesn't replace all state management solutions like use state. All these things are used in use context, but it is not replacement. Use multiple focused context instead of one large global context. We should not use a big large context which has every property inside it. That is the one. So next one is, what is a context provider? A context provider is a React component that makes a value available to all its descendant components. So if you create a context provider, that can be used in other components. So whenever you create a context, there is two level of thing is there. One is context provider, one is context consumer. So this is the provider, the another one is a consumer where we will use the context. So React create two things, provider and consumer. This is customer context is a sample. Okay. So the provider supplies the value and consumer read it. For example, in when I create a context, I will create using this kind of a value where where I'm using it, but this is the usage. No, this is the place where I'm using it. The create will be like create context and the create context, but it needs further format. I'll show you clearly. I have an example for that. This is the example. For example, if you see here, if possible, I will expand more if you're not able to see here. So create context. This is my user context.jx. So what I am doing is I'm creating a context. This is my provider where I'm setting my state. It can be a variable, it can be object. I'm setting a state. My username is Abhirami. So this is the one, the user context.provider. The value is this. Wherever my children is there, this context can be there. This is the function. This is the user context JX. If you want to create a context, this is the user context JX. Here I'm using create context and use state. So whenever the user is changed, the name will be changed here. That is the example. Wrap up with the provider. So here so for example, in my main.jx in the I'm having a user provider where my application main page will be there. It is there. So in my header, if I told in Amazon, if there is a header, my user will be there. So I'm using my use context here, welcome user. So I'm reading user from context. If there is another page where a profile page, I want to change a user here, what I'm doing, I'm updating the user in the context. So I'm using the context here, my profile, the user data is there. When the button on click is happen, I'm setting the user as the John. So now my user state is changing from whatever I had earlier to another hard coded value. As it is example, it is hard coded. If you have a text box, you can change it also. So this button, whenever it clicks, then it will change to John. So the username is changed. And another one is dashboard.jx. Here also I'm using reading, reads update user. So I'm reading the updated user. This is one sample where you can see all the place. I created the context and I'm using the context everywhere. The context is used. So use context. Okay, so this is the output of the example. So initially it is there a welcome my name with my details. Once I press the change user button, as I mentioned here, the user is automatically changed to John. So first we are creating the context and user provider is created and the context is used. Whenever the value is changed, it re-render. If I didn't change the value, I want to have everywhere the user object to be. I want to pass the value as a hard-coded value by everywhere. Or I want to pass the user state everywhere. Okay, here I'm just passing my user provider as a tag. Use context. I'm using my use context. Use context. That's it. So why do we need a provider? Without a provider, React has no shared value to distribute. The provider is a main thing which sharing the value to the other component. Without this provider, you can't share the value to the next component. That is a main important factor. If you see in the above example, I have just imported the user context. That is the reason I'm not able to use the user state. Otherwise, I can't use it. As is the user context, that is the value I can use the user, the constant user defined pay use context only. You can see this code. Okay. So it is kind of a broadcast station that I can broadcast this context to all my dissonant component. So it receives. So this is the prop. So this is the value prop. If whenever you have set it here, I have used the used state, which is the there. So whenever I have this is a directly a constant where I can use it. The another way is you can use so you set state so the value can be changed. So set theme. So the theme, this is the state. So you can change the context using use state. Okay. Can the provider pass function? Yes, the provider can pass the function inside the provider. For example, the set customer is the one of a function. It can use to pass the function. Can there be multiple providers? Obviously, when I have multiple contexts, multiple provider can be available. Each provider manage its own responsibility. Can providers be nested? Yes, providers, all the components, if every component can be nested, every providers and every context can be nested. Nested providers are common. So this is my art provider. I have the provider, customer provider, dashboard. So everything is can be used in the same page. So for example, I have a common page where I have there my dashboard should have the username, the another user name. My app main page should have another username. If that is possible, yes, that is possible. You can use the nearest matching provider. So React searches the from its upward. So it profile this will use the customer provider and the dashboard use the provided. This is possible. If profile calls customer use content, it receives alives because this is the inner provider. This is called inner provider that is very nearby. It is kind of a hierarchical. When you didn't use any state or anything which is not common, you can provide a component different value to the provider and use it in another component. That is the part. If the component value changes, automatically the values will be reflected into the component. How to the state, how it is shared, that is a very important. It is based on the handling. Here I have set customer, which I set the state. Based on that, it will reflect in every value. If I used just the value and changed in a particular content, it will be different. So how it is defined, how we are using is very important according to the use context. Does every child component re-enter? That is the main thing we already saw. No, everything wherever I use the customer context, only that page will be used. That is the main reason that we are using use context. So always we are proposing whenever we use value as a this kind of a thing, it always created new object reference which is not recommended. Other than that, they are recommending use memo. That context was not hook was not explained yet. I'll explain in another thing. But whenever the mostly the reuse memo will be used when we reuse repeatedly some property instead of creating new object reference, it will refer the same object. That is a main usage of this use memo. So it is suggested to better to use memo or use state, not directly. So can a component update context? Yes, but not directly. It is indirect. I can update my value like using set state or use some other function. I can update my function. We have already saw the use state value. So based on that, you can change it. Yes, we can have multiple context. This is sample structure. Always as a developer and enterprise, we need to have a clear structure. So this is a suggestion, recommendation. Is use context is hook itself not available in the class component. So yes, it doesn't has the component. What happens if there is no provider? If I didn't define any provider, what it will have it? It takes the default value. That is the main thing here. Whether use context store data? No, the use context doesn't store the data. Only provider components store the data. Context just share the data. That is the main advantage. So these are about the theory. I have a simple sample real example for you, which is similar to which I have shown. So I have created a header.jx in my pages, in my header.jx, where I have defined my username, all these things, and I have created a context, user context, which I have my logged in user Abhirami as a role as admin. This is my provider app. Wherever it is called, the provider will return the logged in user. It is a constant object. Okay. So I have included in my app.jx my user provider. Also, I have my incident summary page I have created to explain this context because it is another page. So there also the user context will be navigated. So to explain that, I have used that also, the user context. So use user. So it will be wherever the page navigated, I have navigated this. The React router DOM, don't refer now. I will explain it later. So this is the page that I used. Okay, so if you see, this is my dashboard where I have my name and my role, which you have seen already this page. Here I have introduced a link which will navigate to another page. This page is still the header, use the same one. That is the context that I want to explain here. It is a header. So if I go back to my dashboard, even though my use context is still available. Yep. So that's it from my side. Thank you.